within the sphere of public interest journalism, the reason why it exists is because it holds truth to power. And it doesn't have to be adversarial. And over the tenure that I've had, I've seen so many amazing examples where affecting change through public interest journalism done right, with the most detail paid to the operational and digital security of an investigation, literally ended up with laws being changed and legislation being written in order to make sure the problem that the journalist pointed out does not happen again. One of my favorite is with Reuters. They wrote a story about how members of the intelligence community in Washington, D.C., after they had left Washington, D.C., were being actively poached by intelligence services in the UAE. So it would take leaving members of the people working in Washington, D.C., place them in cushy intelligence jobs at the UAE in order to work on programs that we know are surveillance heavy, antithetical to all of our interests, public interest, as well as the interests of the United States government. And when that reporting came out, literally Congress approved a bill saying that you have to wait 3 years before you can go through that revolving door rotation. And that's the trajectory that makes me the most proud to work where I do.
That's Harlo Holmes talking about some of the critically important journalism that she's able to help facilitate in her role with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I'm Cindy Cohn, the Executive Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
And I'm Jason Kelley, EFF's Activism Director. This is our podcast, How to Fix the Internet.
On this show, we flip the script from the dystopian doom and gloom thinking we all get mired in when thinking about the future of tech. We're here to challenge ourselves, our guests, and our listeners to imagine a better future that we could be working towards. What can we look forward to if we dare to dream about getting things right?
Our guest today, Harlo Holmes, is the Chief Information Security Officer and the Director of Digital Security at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, where she teaches journalists how to keep themselves and their sources safe online.
We started off by getting Harlo to explain exactly how the Freedom of the Press Foundation operates.
What we do, I like to say, is a three-pillared approach to protecting press freedom in the 21st century. The first, absolutely most important, is our advocacy team. So not only do we have a staff of lawyers and legal scholars that weigh in on First Amendment issues and protect them within the United States, we also have a fantastic advocacy team at our own little newsroom, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, where we have reporters who anytime members of the press have their right to perform their rightful function challenged, minimized, persecuted, etc., we have reporters who are there who report on it. And we stay with those cases for as long as it takes. And that's something that we're incredibly proud of. That's just one pillar. The other pillars that we have is our engineering wing. So perhaps you've heard of a tool called Secure Drop. In certain newsrooms all over the planet, it's actually installed in order to technologically enable as much anonymity as technically possible between reporters at those newsrooms and members of the press at large who might want to be whistleblowers or just to, say hey to a news outlet that they admire in a way that ensures their anonymity. And then there is my small team. We are the digital security team. We do a lot of training, consulting, security audits, and other supports that we can provide to newsrooms, independent journalists, freelancers, documentary filmmakers, anyone who is making independent journalism in the public interest in order to do their job more safely and securely.
Yeah, I think this is a really important thing that the Freedom of the Press Foundation does, specifically your piece of it, this kind of connective tissue between the people who are really busy doing the reporting and finding things out and the people who want to give them information and making sure that this whole thing is protected in a secure way. And I appreciate that you put it third, but to me, it's really central to how this whole thing works. So I think that's really important. And of course, Secure Drop for, old time EFF and digital rights people, we know that this piece of technology was developed by our friend Aaron Swartz before he passed away. And the Freedom of the Press Foundation has picked it up and really turned it from a good but small idea into something that is vital and in newsrooms all around the world.
Yes. And thank you very, very much for recognizing those particular achievements. SecureDrop has grown over the past, 12 years, I would say, into not only a tool that enables the groundbreaking amount of journalism that has pretty much changed the trajectory of current events over the years that it's been developed, but also represents increasing advances in technology around security that everyone on the planet benefits from. So, for example, SecureDrop would not be anywhere were it not for its deep collaboration with the Tor project, right? And for all of us who pay attention to digital security, cryptography, and the intersection with human rights, you know that the Tor network is a groundbreaking piece of technology that not only provides, anonymity on the internet in an increasingly data greedy environment, but also represents the ways that people can access parts of the internet in so many different innovative ways. And investigative journalism use in SecureDrop is just one example of the benefits of having Tor around and having it supported. And so that's one example. Another example is that as people's interactions with computers change, the way that we interface with browsers change, the interplay between, using a regular computer and accessing stuff on mobile, that's changed, right? And so our team has such commendable intellectual curiosity in talking about these nuances and finding ways to make people's safety using all of these interfaces better. And so even though we build SecureDrop in service of promoting public interest journalism, the way that it reverberates in technology is something that we're incredibly proud of. And it's all done in open source, right? Which means that anyone can access it, anyone can iterate upon it, anyone can benefit from it.
Yeah, and everyone can trust it because, you might not be able to read the code, but many people can. And so this developing this trust and security, they go hand in hand.
You use this term data greedy, which I really love. I've never heard that before.
I just came up with it.
It's so good.
So you just created this incredible term, data greedy, that I've never heard anyone use and I love. And it's a good descriptor, I think, of sort of why journalists, but also everyone needs to be aware of the tracks that they're leaving, the digital security practices that they use, because it's not even necessarily the case that data collection is intended to be harmful, but we just live in this environment where data is collected, where it's, used sometimes intentionally to track people, but often just for other reasons. Let's talk a little bit about that third pillar. What is it that journalists specifically need to think about in terms of security? I think a lot of people probably who have never done journalism don't really think about the dangers of collecting information, of talking to sources, of protecting that. How should they be thinking about it, and what are the kinds of things that you talk to people about?
Great question. First and foremost, I feel that our team at Freedom of the Press Foundation leads every training with the assumption that a journalist's job is to tell the story in the most compelling and effective way. Their job is not to concern themselves with what data stewardship means, what protection of digital assets means. That's our job. And so we really, really lean into meeting people where they are and just giving them exactly what it is that they need to know in order to do this job better, without putting undue pressure on them and also without scaring the bejesus out of anyone. Because when you do take stock of how data greedy all of our devices are, it can be a little bit scary to the point of making people feel disempowered. And so we always want to avoid that.
Yeah. What are some techniques you use to try to avoid that? Because I think that's really central to a lot of work that we're trying to do to try to get people beyond what I think my colleague Eva Galperin called privacy nihilism.
Oh, gosh.
I'm not sure if she started it. She's the one who I heard it from.
I probably have heard that from her as well. I love Eva And she has been so instrumental in the way that I think through these issues over the past decade. So yeah, digital security nihilism is 100% a thing. And perhaps maybe later we can get into the regional contours of that, because people in the United States have exhibit a certain amount of nihilism. And then if you talk to people in Central and Eastern Europe, it's a different way. If you talk to people in Latin America and South America, it's a different way. So having that perspective actually really helps the contours around how you approach people in digital security education and training.
Oh, please tell us more. I'm fascinated by this.
Okay, so I do want to come back to your original question, but that said, I can definitely do a detour into the historicity of digital security nihilism and how it interplays with where you are on the planet. It's all political. And in the United States, we have even though we're currently in a crisis mode, where we're absolutely looking at, our rights to privacy, the concessions that we make, our prominence in building these technologies, and thus having a little bit of insider knowledge of what the contours are. If you compare that to the digital security protections of people who are in, let's say, Central or Eastern Europe, where historically they have never had, or not for, decades, if not even 100 years, that access to transparency about what's being done to their data, and also transparency into how that data has been taken away from them because they didn't have a seat at the table. If you look at places in Latin America, Central America, South America, there are plenty of places where loss of digital security also comes hand in hand with loss of physical security, right? Speaking to someone over the phone can often, especially where journalists are considered, will often come with a threat of physical violence, often to the most extreme.
Yes,
right?
We've seen this in Mexico a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, according to so many, academics and scholars who focus on press freedom, know that is one of the most dangerous places on the planet to be a journalist, because failures in digital security can often come with literally, being summarily executed. Right. So every region on this planet has their own contours. It is constantly a fascinating challenge, and one that I'm willing to meet in order to understand these contexts and to appropriately apply the right digital security solutions to the audiences that we find ourselves in front of.
Okay, back to my original question. Sorry.
Yes, go for it.
Well, what is, did we get to the point? I don't think we really covered yet, really, the basics of what journalists need to think about in terms of their security. That's,
right.
I love talking about privacy nihilism and how we can fight it, but
yeah, I think you're right, Jason.
We would talk for 3 hours if we did that.
Yeah. So quite frankly, one of the things that we're leaning most heavily on, and this is pretty much across the board, right, has to do with compartmentalization. I feel that recently within the United States, it's become really technicolor to people, so they understand exactly why that's important, but it's always been important, and it's always something that you can apply everywhere. There's always historically been a tension since the very moment the first iPhone stepped onto the market, this temptation to go the easy route. Everything is on the same device. You're calling your mom, you're, researching a flight on Expedia, you're, Googling something, and then you're also talking to a source about a sensitive story, or you're also gonna go through the comments in the Google Doc on the report that you're writing regarding a national security issue. People definitely do need to be encouraged to decouple the ways that they treat devices, because these devices are not our friends, and the companies that create the experiences on these devices, they are definitely not our friends. They never have been, but I hear you on that. And reminding people, despite their digital security nihilism, despite their temptation to do the easiest of things, just reminding people to apply appropriate compartmentalization. We take things very slowly. We take things as easily as we possibly can, because there are ways that people can get started. in order to actually be effective at this until they get to the point where it actually means something either to their livelihoods or the story that they're working on and that of the sources that they interact with. But yeah, that's pretty much where it starts. Also, credential security is like the bread and butter. And I've been at this for almost exactly 10 years at FPF and, within this industry for about 15. And it never changes that people really, really do need to maintain as much rigor regarding how people access their accounts. So like you got to have a unique, complex password. You have to be using a password manager. You have to be using multi-factor authentication. And the ways that you can get it have changed over the years and they get better and better and better. You have to be vigilant against phishing, but the ways that people try to phish you are like, increasingly like sneakier. We deal with it as it comes, but ultimately that has never changed. It really hasn't.
So we've talked a little bit about kind of the nihilism and the kind of thicket of things that you have to kind of make your way through in order to help journalists and their sources feel more secure. So let's flip it a bit. What does it look like if it's better? What are the kinds of places where you see, if we could get this right, it would start to get better?
I love this question because I do feel that I've been able to look at it from multiple sides. Similarly, as I was describing how SecureDrop not only enables impactful public interest journalism, it represents a Herculean feat of cryptography and techno activism. This is one example. Signal is another example. So one of the things I thought was so poignant when, as Joe Biden was exiting the White House, one of his parting shots was to say, everyone should use Signal. And the reason why he says this is because Signal not only represents a cool app or a thing that hackers love and, we can be proud of because we got in on the first floor. It represents the evolution of technologies that we should have. Our phone conversations had not been encrypted. Now they are. Get with it. That's the point. So from a technical perspective, that's what is so important. And that's something that we always want to position ourselves to champion.
Let's take a quick moment to say thank you to our sponsor. How to Fix the Internet is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Program in Public Understanding of Science and Technology, enriching people's lives through a keener appreciation of our increasingly technological world and portraying the complex humanity of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians. We also want to thank EFF members and donors. You can become a member for just $25, and for a little more, you can get some very good, very stylish gear. Your support is the reason we can keep our digital security guides for journalists and everyone else up to date to deal with the latest threats. So please, if you like what we do, go to EFF.org/pod to donate. We also wanted to share that our friend Cory Doctorow has a new podcast. Have a listen to this.
How did the internet go from this?
You could actually find what you were looking for right away, bang,
to this.
I feel like I'm in hell.
Spoiler alert, it was not an accident. I'm Cory Doctorow, host of Who Broke the Internet from CBC's Understood. In this 4-part series, I'm going to tell you why the internet sucks now, whose fault it is, and my plan to fix it. Find Who Broke the Internet on whatever terrible app you get your podcasts.
And now back to our conversation with Harlo Holmes. Are there tools that are missing that in a better world you're like, oh, this would be great to have, or things that maybe couldn't exist without changes to technology or to the way that people work or to policy that you just absolutely hear, oh, it would be nice if we could do this, but for whatever reason, that's not a place we're at yet?
Yeah, actually, I have started to have a couple of conversations about that. Before I answer, I will say that I don't have the bandwidth or time to be a technologist. It's my code writing days are probably over, but I have so many opinions.
Of course, so many ideas. Yeah.
Well, we're your audience, right? I mean,
True,
the EFF audience are people who, not overwhelmingly, but a lot of people with technical skills who are trying to figure out, okay, how do I apply them to do good? And I think, over the years, we've seen a lot of really well-meaning efforts by technologists to try to do something to support other communities that weren't grounded enough in those communities, and so didn't really work. And I think your work at Freedom of the Press Foundation, again, has kind of bridged that gap, especially for journalists, but there's broader things. So where else could you see places where technologists could really dig in and have this work in a way that sometimes it does, but often it doesn't?
I love that question because that is exactly the point, right? Bridging the gap. And I feel that like at FPF, given, how I introduce it with like the 3 pillars or whatever, we are uniquely poised in order to perform like, user research within a community, right? And then have that directly inform technology mandates, have that directly inform advocacy, charge to action. So I think anyone who finds themselves at those cross sections, that's exactly what you have to kind of like strategize around in order to be as effective as possible. In terms of like actual technologies, one thing, and I already kind of started having these conversations with people, is let's take our relationship within a typical newsroom to cloud services like Google when you are drafting, right? I mean, it's anecdotal, and like the plural of anecdote is not data, right? But that said, we do know that given that, Google's Drive has so much machine learning and AI enabled power, drafting a story that's like the next Watergate, right? Like that's actually going to get you put in jail before you get to publish, right? Because we know about their capabilities. And not going to like talk about specific anecdotes, but like that is a thing, right? But one of the things, or like the big contention, is that actually, like in terms of collaboration, how effective you can be writing a story, how like, you rely on the comments section with your editor, right, as you're massaging a story. You rely on those features as much. What are open source, like, hacker ethos alternatives? We have Nextcloud, we have CryptPad, we have Etherpad, but all of those things are insufficient, not only like in terms of their feature set, in what needs to be accommodated in order for a journalist to work, right? But also can be insufficient in terms of their sustainability models, the fact that we can rely upon them in the future. And as much as we love all of those people at those developer initiatives, no one is supporting them to make sure that they can be in a place to be a viable alternative, right? So what's the next frontier, right? If I don't want to live in a world where a Nextcloud doesn't exist, where a CryptPad doesn't exist, or an Etherpad. Like, that's not what I'm saying, because they're fantastic and they're really great to use in creative scenarios. However, if you're thinking about the meat and potatoes day to day in a typical newsroom, and you have to contend with a tech giant like Google that has become increasingly like ideologically unreliable, guess what? They actually do have a really cool tool called client-side encryption, right? So now you're actually like removing the people who decide at Google what is ideologically acceptable use of their tools, right? You're removing them from the position where they can make any decision or scrutinize further. And client-side encryption, or like anything that provides end-to-end encryption, that is like the ultimate goal. That's what we should protect, whether it is in SecureDrop, whether it is in Nextcloud or CryptPad, or if it's in Google itself. And so actually, I would recommend like anybody who has the spare cycles to contribute to a developer effort to tackle this type of middleware that allows us to still have as much autonomy as possible within the ecosystems that we have to kind of work within.
Oh, I love that. I mean, it's a story of interoperability, right? What you're talking about middleware in this area is like, we should be able to make a choice, either use things that are not hosted corporately, or use things that are hosted corporately, but be able to have our cake and eat it too. Have a tool that helps us interoperate with that system without the bad parts of the deal.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
And in this instance, the bad parts of the deal are a piece of it is the business model, but a piece of it is just compliance with government in a way that the company is increasing, used to fight. They still fight some. They might fight, yes, but they also don't have the ability to fight that much. We might want to go to something that's a little that gives them the ability to say, look, we don't have access to that information, just like Apple doesn't have access to the information that's stored on your iPhone. They made a policy decision to protect you.
But now we're looking at what happened in the UK and we're like,
Exactly. But then the government has to actually, so it's always a fight on the technical level and on the policy level. Sadly, I wish that encryption we could, fix with just technology, but we need other forms of protection. But I love this idea of having so many options, some that are decentralized, some that are hosted, in the nonprofit world, some that might be publicly supported, and then some that are the corporate side, but with the protections that we need. And I just feel like we need all of the above. Anybody who asks you to choose between these strategies is kind of getting you caught in a side fight when the main fight is how do we get people the privacy that they need to do their work?
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that gives me the most hope is continuing to fight in a space where we are all about the options. We're all about giving people options and being as creative as possible in building options for everyone.
What else gives you hope? Because you've been at Freedom of the Press for a while now, and we're at a difficult time in a lot of ways, but I assume there are other things that you've, seen change over the years in a positive way, right? Because it feels too easy to say, look, things are getting dire, because in many ways they are. But what else gives you hope, given how long you've been working on this issue?
I love really thinking through the new challenges of other types of media that is represented. So much of my career had been pretty much centered around traditional print and or digital. However, I am so enthusiastic about being alongside like podcasters and YouTube creators as they navigate these new challenges and also understand like the long history of media theory, where we've gone as an industry in order to understand how it applies to them. So one thing that I thought was pretty cool was having a conversation recently with a somewhat influential TikTok person about class consciousness in regards to whether or not people who are influencers should actually start considering themselves as journalists legitimately. And one of the things that I mentioned had to do with the fact that, like in the 2010s, bloggers were not considered quote unquote journalists. And yet blogging has become one of the most influential, even like from a financial perspective, like drivers within this market. So influencers should not consider themselves anything other than journalists because their fights are, especially like when, platforms get involved and like what their economic model looks like and their, integrity and ethos within journalism, like that's the media history that we are building right now. So that excites me.
Oh, that's great. EFF was involved in some of the early cases about whether bloggers could be protected by journalism shield laws. We had a case called Apple v. Doe's a long time ago that helped establish that in the state of California. But I really love helping kind of new media think of itself as media. And also, the way that I always think about it is it's not whether you're a journalist, it's whether you're doing journalism.
Yes,
right? It's the verb part. And that different framing then I think helps break people out of the mold of, well, I do some stuff that's just kind of silly and that might not be journalism. But if you're bringing news to the public, if you're bringing information to the public that the public wants, even if it's in a fashion context, like that's journalism.
It is.
And it should have, you should think of yourself that way because there is this rich history of how we protect that and how important that is to society. Not just about the kind of hard political issues, but actually, in creating and shaping and managing our culture as well.
I agree 100%.
How did you end up doing this kind of digital security work specifically for journalists? Did you make an intentional choice at some point that you wanted to help journalists, or have you sort of found yourself here and it's just incredible, important work?
A little bit of both. I'm an avid media consumer who cares a lot about media history. And in undergraduate school, I studied comparative literature, which is all based off of the fact that the media itself has its own unique power. And the way that it is expressed says way more than what is actually said. And I've always found that to be the most important thing to do. As far as technology is concerned, as any young, inquisitive person might do, I got into coding like so hardcore. And it wasn't until I was in grad school that I discovered via a class with this fantastic person, Nathan Freitas, who's a Harvard Beekman Fellow Emeritus and also the head of the Guardian Project, where he opened my eyes to the fact that like the code that you're writing, just like, for fun or whatever, like you can actually use this to defend human rights. And so it was kind of the culmination of those ideas that led me through like a couple of things. Like I was an open news fellow at the New York Times for about a year, where I worked with the computer assisted reporting team. And that was really impressive. And that was the first time where I got to see how people will like scrape a web page in order to write an investigative story. And I was like, wow, people do that. That's so cool. And then also because I was hanging out with like Nathan and other folks, I was the one of the kids in the newsroom floor who knew what Tor was. They're like, that's cool. How do we use this in journalism? And I'm like, well, I got ideas. And that's how my career got started.
That's so great. Nathan's an old friend of EFF. That's so fun to hear the tentacles of how, people inspire other people. I think that's part of the fun story of digital rights.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think anyone is super duper lucky to understand not only like the place that you occupy right now, but also where it sits within like a long history. And I also really love any experience where I get to kind of touch people with that as well.
Ooh, that's a nice place to end. What do you think, Jason?
That sounds great. Yeah. And think of all the people who are saying the same thing about you now that you're saying about Nathan, right? It never stops. So
It shouldn't ever stop. It shouldn't. This is our history.
Oh, Harlo, thank you so much for coming and spending time with us. It's just been a delight to talk to you, and good luck going forward. The times really need people like you.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I love your pod. I love the work that you do. And I'll, see you next time.
Well, I'm really glad that we got a chance to talk to Harlo, because these conversations with folks who work in these specific areas with people are really helpful when, it's not our job every day to talk to journalists, just like it's not our job every day to talk to specific advocates about specific issues, but you learn exactly what the kinds of things are that they think about and what we need to get things right and what it'll look like if we do get things right for journalists or whomever it is.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I loved about the conversation is the stuff that she articulated is stuff that will help all of us. It's a particular need for journalists. But when we asked her, what kind of tools need to exist, she pointed, not only to the open source, decentralized tools like Etherpad and things like that, but to basically an interoperability issue that making Google Docs secure so that Google doesn't know what you're saying on your Google Docs. And I would toss Slack in there as well, that, taking the tools that people rely on every day and building in things that make them secure against the company and against government coming and strong-arming the company into giving them information. Like that's a tool that will be really great for journalists. And I can see that. It'll also help all the rest of us.
Yeah.
And the other thing she said when she was giving, what advice do you give to journalists, like off the top? She said, well, use separate devices for the things that you're doing, and don't have everything on one device, because I think I love what did she say? They're data hungry.
Data greedy.
Data greedy, even better. that our devices are data greedy. So separating them gives us something. That's a useful piece of information for anybody who's involved in activism.
Yeah. And so, I want to say easy. It's not always simple to have two devices, but the idea that the solution wasn't something more complicated, it reminds me that often the best advice is something that's fairly simple, and that really, anyone who has the ability and the money could have multiple devices, and journalists are no different. So it reminded me also that, when we're working on things like our surveillance self-defense guides, it's helpful to remember that, like Harlo said, her job is to make the journalist's job easy, right? They shouldn't have to think about this stuff. And that's how sort of the spirit of the guides that we write as well. And that was just a really good reminder that sometimes you feel like you're trying to convince everyone or explain to them how all these tools work. And actually, it might be better to think about, well, you shouldn't have to understand all of this deeply like I do. In some cases, you just need to know that this works, and that's what you need to use.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, obviously, just go out and buy a second device isn't advice that we would give to people in parts of the world where that's really a prohibitive suggestion. But there are many parts of the world, and journalists, many of them live in them, where it is actually not that hard a thing to do to get yourself a burner phone or get a simpler phone for your work, rather than having to try to configure one device to really support all of those things, and turning on 2FA, right? Turning on two-factor authentication, another thing that is just good advice for anybody. So, what I'm hearing is that, if we build a place that is better for journalists, it's better for all of us, and vice versa. If we build a world that's better for all of us, it's also better for journalists. So I really liked that. I also really liked her articulating and lifting up the role that the Tor project plays in what they do with Secure Drop, what they do to try to help protect journalists who have confidential sources, because as we're looking into all of these various tools that help create a better future, a more secure future, we're discovering that actually open source tools like Tor underlie many different pieces of the better world. And so we're starting to see kind of the network for good, right? The conspiracy for good of a lot of the open source security projects.
I didn't really realize when we were putting together these guests for this season how interconnected they all were. And it's been really wonderful to hear everyone lift everyone else up. They really do all depend on one another. And it is really important to see that for the people who maybe don't think about it and use these tools as one-offs, right?
Yeah. And I think as those of us who are trying to make the internet better, recognizing that we're all in this together. So as we're headed into this time where we're seeing a lot of targeted attacks on different pieces of a secure world, recognizing that these things are interconnected and then building strength from there seems to me to be a really important strategy.
And that's our episode for today. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have feedback or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Visit EFF.org/podcast and click on listener feedback. And while you're there, you can become a member and donate, maybe even pick up some of the merch, and just see what's happening in digital rights this week and every week. Our theme music is by Nat Keefe of Beatmower with Reed Mathis, and How to Fix the Internet is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Program in Public Understanding of Science and Technology. We'll see you next time. I'm Jason Kelley.
And I'm Cindy Cohn.
This podcast is licensed Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International and includes the following music licensed Creative Commons Attribution 3.0, unported by its creators. Drops of H2O, The Filtered Water Treatment by Jay Le. Sound design, additional music, and theme remixes by Gaetan Harris.